Okay, guys, so Act 2 begins with one of the most famous pieces of sort of physical stagecraft in a birthday party, and it's the stage business and McCann sitting at the table tearing a sheet of newspaper into 5 equal strips. I think, personally, this is one of those moments where we're looking for figurative content sort of aimlessly in a certain fashion. That I think the meaninglessness of the action itself actually becomes the key part in terms of, in understanding its overall function from a dramatic perspective. There's the paper tearing becomes involved in the physical stagecraft and the interactions between McCann and Stanley in the build up to the interrogation, and it becomes the thing that they first really quibble over, they first argue about. And I think the fact that it's meaningless, its sort of abstract quality, is central to the way in which Pinter represents the relationship between individuals and power itself. If we think back to the notion that the identity itself is contingent and relative, it's something that we absolutely don't have access to in an authentic fashion, even of ourselves, and actually we go about kind of masking ourselves and shrouding ourselves from the knowledge of others. The only way then Pinter seems to be arguing that we can make sense of ourselves is through a sense of relativism, of relation between individuals. And that naturally that relation itself is distant and inauthentic. And that the only tangible way in which identity is made sense of in that relative fashion, that relativistic fashion, is in terms of hierarchy and power. And it's simply the understanding of self emerges purely from the way in which people interact with each other in a hierarchical fashion and dominate each other. And the actual abstract, sort of semantics of their interaction, the meaning of their interaction and the language that they use and their own sense of self is really nothing more than the experience that is produced in that hierarchical interaction. And so the meaninglessness of this paper tearing and the conflict of power that it centers upon later on and throughout this scene, it is important that it is itself meaningless, because it's exposing the way in which the only way that we can make sense of ourselves is through this relational hierarchical contest that we have to either be the dominant or the subordinate one, and it doesn't really matter actually what we're talking about. And so Pinter's trying deliberately to expose the sham of the meaningfulness of power and of identity itself in relation to that. So McCann opens the scene sitting at the table tearing a sheet of newspaper into 5 equal strips, and it gives us our conventional codes of understanding, and this is particularly a stark point of contrast with Streetcar, is that these pieces of stage direction that construct the stage business at the beginning of major transitions in the text are meaningful. They are producing figurative and implied meaning that is going to be crucial to our understanding of the text. And that is still the case, but I wouldn't argue necessarily that it's figurative, because its figurative quality is precisely that it's meaningless, and that its meaning is empty. Its meaning comes from its lack of meaning, so to speak. And so what we then see, what follows, is a naked exposure of that nakedly hierarchical way in which people interact and that power operates. So it's evening. After a few moments, Stanley enters from the left. He stops upon seeing McCann and watches him, and he then walks towards the kitchen, stops and speaks. So his hesitancy, I think, in these stage directions brings about a stark contrast with the opening of the first act. He's lauding it like he's the kind of king of his own castle, and here this sense of disturbance and uncertainty marks his interaction in the play, but it also invites comparison with Blanche's own physicality and her movement during those moments in the play where Stanley Kowalski is dominating the physical space. And again, we have a number of those sort of hollow salutations, evening, that in their absolute similarity and synchronicity replicate themselves and expose, I think, the sort of meaninglessness of them. Chuckles are heard from outside the back door, which is open. There's this kind of sinister quality to this, that a think in terms of the naturalism of this particular scene, it's implied that it's perhaps Meg and Lulu, or Meg and someone else, or Meg and Goldberg sort of enjoying themselves, perhaps in a beneficent way, plotting the birthday. But of course that means something completely different to Meg than it means to Goldberg. Goldberg seeing this as this kind of sinister opportunity to destroy Stanley's identity, and Meg seeing this as a precisely the opposite, as a ritual to affirm who he is. Stanley says it's very warm tonight. Again, classic British empty linguistic salutation, talking about the weather that absolutely has no, its purpose is to focus your attention on externalities rather than the internal life of your own feelings and your own subjectivity. He turns towards the back door and back. Someone out there? Again, the fact that he's aware of the answer to this question and asks it, again, shows that his questions are becoming kind of tautological. They're needless repetitions that mirror Meg's own dialogue, and I think reveal to us his own sense of uncertainty. McCann tears another length of paper and again obviously refuses to respond to this. He's refusing to participate in the dialogue that might construct authentic meaning, and Stanley goes into the kitchen and pours a glass of water. So again, this is important in terms of the contrast between what's going on now with this disturbing external presence in the scenario that he's in, and in comparison to the way he behaves in the opening scene, where he's completely passive and is waiting for Meg to do everything for him. He drinks it looking through the hatch, and again there's this sort of obsessive vigilance that forms a contrast with the opening scene. He's watchful now and on his toes, so to speak, in a way that in the opening he completely, he's the complete reverse in the opening, a total sense of indolent complacency. He puts the glass down, comes out of the kitchen and walks quickly towards the door left. And again, I think that stage direction again brings those two concepts of freedom and power together. He comes out of the kitchen and walks quickly towards the door left. McCann rises and intercepts him. And this is where the physicality of this interaction is telling us a lot more about the authentic way in which people can relate to each other by dominating each other, by hierarchical interaction, than the language that they're using, because we see this conflicted physicality here being completely undermined in this dialogue. The politesse of this dialogue and the sort of familiar friendliness of it completely betrays a different vision of reality to the conflicted physicality of the stagecraft. And McCann says, "I don't think we've met." "No, we haven't. My name's McCann. Staying here long? Not long. What's your name?" "Webber." "I'm glad to meet you, sir." So we've got this kind of Stanley immediately seeming quite assertive, but I think it reveals his fear more than anything. No, we haven't that sense of certainty. There's very little certainty in these plays in terms of people's lives. And McCann here, I think that first act of naming, my name's McCann, that assertion of identity is again equivalent to that sense of domineering power that we see him enact as the scene unfolds. Stanley here, instead of reciprocating, asks a question: "Are you staying here long?" And I think the fact that he's deliberately trying not to reciprocate by saying his name, again, betrays his sense of uncertainty and fear. But again, it's not a coincidence that uncertainty and fear is registered through his refusal to identify himself. That it's that lack of integrity of identity, integrity of the self, that provides the basis for subordination, for manipulation, and for those in positions of power to dominate you. McCann says, "I'm glad to meet you, sir." And again, he borrows that kind of official linguistic rituals that Goldberg is a kind of master of, but that, of course, are kind of empty and hollow in their meaninglessness. He's glad to meet him in one respect, I guess, because it's giving him that clarity about the task that he is about to engage in, that he's so uneasy about in the opening act. And so there is a sort of truth in this, but obviously he's glad to meet him because he's about to try and take part in the destruction of his identity. He offers his hand, Stanley takes it, and McCann holds the grip. And again, the physicality here shows us that this is a power play. McCann is the one that lingers with the holding of the grip, and this is one of the most famous sort of parts of body language that communicate power and hierarchy, the handshake. Many happy returns of the day. Stanley withdraws his hand, they face each other. "Were you going out?" And I think here, he he makes this kind of positive everyday ritual of shaking someone's hand and wishing them a happy birthday reveal its kind of sinister power-based dynamic that actually we're taking the moment of wishing someone a happy birthday and greeting them and revealing the naked hierarchical power relations beneath the surface of the act itself. And Stanley, you can see Stanley's detection of that, and this is his virtue, is that he detects this power play as it's undergoing. His weakness is that he fails to respond in the adequate active way with a sense of agency, but that's because he has no self-understanding and no self-possession. They face each other, and again, literally, the language that's being used here, although it's extremely restrained and pinned to stage directions, is again showing us that naked sense of power confrontation that's going on. Just, where are you going out? Yes. On your birthday? Yes. Why not? Of course, the fantastic irony of this is, of course, that Stanley has steadfastly kind of refused to do this earlier. And that we know then that this is the audience is privy to internal content of Stanley's emotional condition. We know that he's more unsettled and nervous than he appears to be betraying. So again, what we're being given is the inauthenticity of the language that they use to communicate with each other. We know that he's absolutely steadfastly refused to go outside, and therefore his assertion that he should, and his meaningless question, well, why not, is actually a sort of rendition of comfort and familiarity and confidence that he has obviously detected that he needs to display to McCann, because he detected that this interaction is a power play. But they're holding a party for you here tonight. Oh, really? That's unfortunate. And of course, I think this deliberately kind of comic irony reveals Stanley's isolationism, his desire to be kept on his own. But there's an ambiguity in that obviously I think also partly reveals his early understanding that it's a sinister threat. It's unfortunate that they're deciding to have this bizarre party for me. And McCann, obviously in reversal of this, says, oh no, it's very nice. He's the one that seems reasonable here. He's the kind of the sociable one that's saying, well, you should, come on, be a bit more cheerful. Someone's holding a party for you. So there are voices outside the back door here, and I think the stage effects here are deliberately social and show us the reason for Stanley's conversion, that we're given these constant sense of people interacting that is being deliberately exposed as Stanley's, fault, that the establishment is unhappy with, that orthodoxy is disturbed by his complete lack of commitment to sort of civic responsibility or commitment to other people and commitment to sociality. I'm sorry, I'm not in the mood for a party tonight. Oh, is that so? I'm sorry. Yes, I'm going out to celebrate quietly on my own. Of course, this is the wonderful sort of sense of sadness about his character from our own conventional understanding, but actually one of the early signs of his integrity, that he's realised that this social ritual that people normally see as a positive thing, he's detected that there's a sense of threat that's lurking beneath the surface of here. And McCann says that's a shame. And obviously this is a kind of false sense of deference, and that's a false sense of understanding, and they both stand simultaneously. So at this moment in time, there's a kind of a parity, a level kind of interaction at this moment in time through their exchange. Stanley says, well, if you'd move out of my way. Of course, Stanley here has realised that the physicality is the centre of this power play, and is trying, I think, to at least make a move to be slightly more dominant in this interaction. And McCann's strength as the interrogator and his power comes from his refusal to let Stanley dominate the physical space. We think here this is inviting comparison with the way that Stanley Kowalski interacts with Blanche in the apartment. He completely dominates the space through his physical signs of dominance and his movements within the way that the scene is set up. And the movements here are, again, in complete contrast to the language. So we're seeing, again, that the language is not communicating the authentic emotional state of the characters. But everything's laid on. The guests are expected. Guests? What guests? Myself, for one. I had the honour of an invitation. Again, we've got this kind of language of almost a kind of official celebration that's going on here. That belies the sinister quality of these lines, you know, that masks the sinister intent of McCann here. McCann begins to whistle the Mountains of Morn, is nostalgic song that I think betrays his sense of Irish nationalism. And Stanley moves away. I wouldn't call it an honour, would you? It'll just be another booze up. So there's an attempt, I think, by Stanley here, and this is where we see his understanding of how other people operate that is strong. He attempts to sort of dispel that kind of faux civility that McCann is trying to demonstrate towards him. He's recognised that this politeness is actually part of the effort to undermine him, and responds to it by trying to make their overblown sense of importance around the birthday party seem completely banal and everyday. But disturbingly, Stanley joins McCann in whistling the Mountains of Morn. And during the next 5 lines, the whistling is continuous. One whistling while the other speaks, and both whistling together. So I think the bizarre thing here, the stage directions of the music, give the duo a kind of shared sense of connection and makes Stanley's identity more uncertain and exposes McCann's Irishness as a kind of performance. You know, we see this not necessarily as some authentic sense of ethnic connection between the two of them. You know, we're reading the Mountains of Morn as this sort of wistful tune about a nostalgia for the homeland for McCann. But if Stanley is able to immediately join in with this song, it exposes its performative nature, and it exposes it as something unreliable in terms of a signifier of ethnic identity. So again, that McCann's authenticity of self is called into question, and the fact that Stanley knows this song, again, casts doubt on what we know about him as a character now. You know, we think of him as this kind of regular sort of English, perhaps middle-class protagonist, this sort of everyman figure, lower middle-class everyman. And yet here he shares his familiarity with this, you know, wistful Irish nationalist song that McCann is using to signify his Irishness. So between the two of them, they both destabilise our sense of the authenticity of both of the characters' identities. So McCann says, but it's an honour. I'd say you were exaggerating. Oh no, I'd say it was an honour. I'd say that was plain stupid. Oh no. So the battle over the tone of this exchange seems quite farcical, you know, that McCann says it's an honour and Stanley quite rightly says that you're exaggerating. I think it masks McCann's determination to pair the sense of civility with sinister intent. And I think that there's an interesting contrast again with Stanley, Kowalski and Streetcar, who very deliberately uses the most blunt and direct language possible because it is destructive of Blanche's sort of self-understanding and Blanche's vision of the way that society works, whereas here the reverse is true. You know, McCann uses evasive language, more complex than perhaps would be necessary to mask the actual intent of his communication and the authenticity of his feelings. They stare at each other, and obviously at this moment in time there's a sense of perhaps unspoken tension in this, and at this point again it's not resolved who is adopting the dominant position in this exchange. But the reason why McCann, you know, why this continues is because McCann wants to keep his effort to dominate Stanley shrouded, and what it's doing to us as an audience is showing us that many of the things that we assume are features of polite interaction, you know, salutations and asking people if they want to attend a birthday party, are actually or can be facilitated in efforts to dominate or subordinate someone to our needs. And Stanley says, well, who are the other guests? A young lady, oh yes, and my friend, your friend. That's right, it's all laid on. Again, the nature of who these guests are supposedly is kept completely abstract and completely undermines the usual purpose of a birthday party, to be around the people that you most value and that give you the most intense, I think, acute perception of your own self-value. So the act of hostility here, Stanley walks around the table towards the door and McCann meets him. The act of hostility seems like one of friendship, you know, that Stanley sort of walks to leave and McCann goes to meet him, and the language itself almost seems quite genial, you know, as if he's going to greet him in some way. And Stanley just says, excuse me, where are you going? I want to go out. Why don't you stay here? And again, the language that's being used here seems polite. Why don't you stay here? Sounds like you want someone to be with you because you value the connection. But of course, this is the domination of physical space here is what's revealing the truth of this interaction. And the reversal of Stanley's intentions in terms of his interaction with Blanche in Streetcar, that McCann's power is evident in his effort to trap Stanley inside the house, and Stanley's intentions in the opening of Streetcar are this, the complete reverse, his desire to banish Blanche from their lives and the threat that she represents to their connection between Stanley and Stella. Stanley moves away to the right of the table, so again he's detected this sense of threat and moves around, but then slips back into this kind of polite conversation. So you're down here on holiday, and the argument is a polite inquiry that's begun, and McCann just says, a short one. And I think the terseness of his response obviously has the sinister connotation of whatever we're doing here, we're going to do it quickly, but also, again, participates in that empty sort of politeness. And this is where the paper comes into play. Stanley picks up a strip of paper, and McCann moves in, mind that, as if he's looking out for Stanley's interest. Oh, be careful of touching that. But of course, the danger is only there because he will inflict it. And Stanley says, what is it? Mind it, leave it. Of course, no answer to what it is. No explanation of actually the significance of the paper itself, but just that he needs to keep his hands off it. So in the same way that Goldberg reassures McCann earlier on in the play, simply by telling him that everything's going to be okay and not actually telling him why, McCann attempts to dominate Stanley here by precisely avoiding giving him any explanation of the significance of the paper and just forcing him to follow his directions around the paper itself. So it's almost like the paper becomes the vehicle for his domination of Stanley. It's an empty sign of this particular hierarchical order. And Stanley, his sort of overall position in society, I think, is sort of reflected in this dialogue of just leaving things alone and staying away from them. At the bottom of this, there's this exchange about whether they know each other. So there's this sort of, I've got a feeling we've met before. There's this vague sense of connection, and that this is where Stanley reveals what we take to be some sort of authentic personal anecdote. He lived in Maidenhead, and there's a Fuller's tea shop and a Boots library. It goes on to be important later on in the play because Goldberg mentions them in one of his own reminiscences. So again, it ties together some sense of realism because it seems to imply that there's some vague possibility of a connection between the two characters. When Stanley says, oh no, it's a quiet, thriving community, I was brought up there, I lived well away from the main road. And then McCann just says, yes. So there's at least some suggestion of a shared past that McCann recognises, but won't verbally acknowledge. He won't actually give Stanley the satisfaction of confirming this because it keeps him feeling unsettled, it keeps him from feeling destabilised. And that pause, I think gives us again perhaps the opportunity to see that Stanley, even in the early days, has been living away from society, and that's precisely why McCann is here, as a way to reintegrate him back into the orthodox construction of the social fabric. And Stanley just says, you're here on a short stay, and he comes back to this topic. That's right. You'll find it very bracing. Do you find it bracing? And so there's a sort of ironic reverse in the plot here, because his hostility is an effort to ward the men off. And of course, the huge irony here is that Stanley is the one who's going to find what happens bracing, and that the fact that it's bracing is in complete contrast to the way that he normally experiences this location, and that he experiences this sort of complacent sense of comfort. Now, Stanley here, I think, tries a different tactic overall to reverse power, and that his effort to gain knowledge of others or to demonstrate knowledge of others is equivalent to a form of power over them. But importantly, he doesn't grasp this with himself, and it's precisely what actually enables Goldberg and McCann to dominate him in the end, is that he lacks a knowledge of his own flaws. He lacks knowledge that passivity is his fatal kind of downfall, his sort of hamasha, if we were looking at it from the perspective of tragedy. But interesting contrast with this is precisely also what allows Stanley to dominate Blanche, the knowledge of the authentic nature of her identity. So knowledge over people, knowledge of people's authentic selves becomes the sort of base currency of interpersonal power in both of these plays. And it's, again, a really important point of contrast, connection between the two of them.